Have you ever wondered what winter sounded like on the old ranches, before electric heat, before grocery stores on every corner, before the weather forecast could warn you what was coming? Imagine standing in a doorway at dawn, the sky white with blowing snow, the wind cutting through the yard like a knife, the barn doors groaning, the water trough frozen solid, and somewhere beyond the drifts cattle waiting to be fed, horses stamping in the dark, children still asleep under heavy quilts, and a family already measuring the danat by comfort, but by endurance, because for ranchers and their families, winter was never just a season. It was a test, a long, hard stretch of cold and silence that asked the same question every year. Are you prepared enough to make it through? For people who lived on ranches in the old days, especially across the American plains and mountain country, winter changed everything. The wide open land that looked beautiful in summer could become a place of danger in a single night. Roads vanished under snow fences, disappeared under drifts, streams turned to ice, and distance itself became an enemy. A neighbor might be only a few miles away, but in a blizzard that could feel like another world. When winter settled in, ranching life pulled inward, closer to the house, the barn, the stove, and above all, the family. The image many people have of the old ranch is one of freedom, open stretches running through grass, cattle moving across sunlit hills. But winter told a different story. Winter was not about freedom, it was about responsibility. Every animal had to be accounted for. Every bale of hay mattered. Every ounce of lamp oil, every sack of flour, every bucket of water carried through the cold. The season demanded planning long before the first snow ever fell. By late summer and early autumn, ranch families were already preparing for what they knew was coming. Hay had to be cut, dried, stacked and protected. Root cellars had to be filled with potatoes, onions, turnips, carrots, and jars of preserved food. Smokehouses and pantries were stocked with cured meats, dried beans, flour, coffee, sugar, and lard. Firewood was chopped and hauled, blankets mended, boots, patched, harness repaired, because once deep winter arrived, there would be little room for mistakes. Every job delayed in autumn became a hardship in January, and that is one of the most revealing things about ranch life in winter. Survival during the coldest months was often decided in the warmer ones. The family that had worked hardest in September might eat better in February. The father checking haystacks, the mother filling shelves with canned fruit and pickled vegetables, the children helping gather kindling or carry water. Even the smallest hands had a purpose. Ranch winter was not survived by one person. It was survived by a household when the storms finally came. Daily life narrowed into a pattern that was both exhausting and deeply routine. Before sunrise, someone was almost always first to the stove, often the mother, sometimes an older daughter, sometimes the rancher himself. If chores pressed early, the house would be bitterly cold, breath visibly in the dim light, kindling crackling first, then thicker wood, then the slow return of warmth, coffee set to boil, biscuit, porridge stirred, maybe salt pork frying in a pan. The kitchen was not only where food was made, it was where morale was made. Warmth, smell, light. These things mattered in winter more than most people today can easily imagine. The first chores could not wait, no matter the weather. Ranchers pulled on stiff frozen coats, scarves wrapped high, gloves already crusted with old snow, boots thick with mud turned to ice, and stepped into the dark. They broke ice from water troughs with axes or bars, carried feed to horses and cattle, checked the barn for sick animals, watched for signs of frostbite or weakness, opened paths through drifts, and listened to the wind. Because in winter, sound could tell you nearly as much as sight. The way a gate rattled, the way cattle called, the way the storm moved across the fields, all of it carried information. During the harshest winters, feeding livestock became the center of the day. Cattle could not graze under heavy snow, so hay had to be hauled out, sometimes by sled, sometimes by wagon, sometimes by sheer labor in conditions that drained strength quickly. Ranchers knew that hungry stock could be lost fast and losing animals was not just emotional. It could ruin a family financially. One hard winter might erase your self-work. So even when fingers went numb and snow blew sideways into their faces, they kept moving, because the herd was their livelihood, and the herd depended completely on them. But winter life was not only hardship in the fields and corrals, it was also the long interior life of the home where women carried an enormous share of the burden, and where the idea of family became something practical and necessary, not just sentimental. while men and older boys were outside with animals. Women often kept the house running like a command center, cooking, baking, sewing, washing, mending, preserving what remained of supplies, caring for younger children, tending the sick, and sometimes helping with outdoor chores too, depending on the weather and the family's needs. Their labor was not secondary, it was foundational. Without it, winter ranch life simply did not function. Children grew up fast in that world, not because anyone intended to steal their childhood, but because survival had no room for idleness. Young boys might carry feed, split kindling, shovel snow and help stable the horses. Girls might help with meals, laundry, sewing, and childcare. Though in truth, ranch families often crossed those lines when necessity demanded it. Everyone learned to notice what needed doing, and to do it. The storm outside did not care about tradition. It cared about whether the family worked together. Yet there were also moments of closeness that only such a life could create. Winter forced people together, literally and emotionally. Evenings were long, dark, and often that only such a life could create. Winter forced people together, literally and emotionally. Evenings were long, dark, and often the warmest room. Clothing drying near the fire, boots lined up by the door, children curled under blankets, someone darning socks, someone cleaning a lantern, someone shelling beans or braiding rope or patching a coat. And in those hours, stories were told. Stories mattered deeply on ranches in winter. They entertained, yes, but they also preserved memory. Grandparents told of earlier winters, of cattle drives, of wolves near the pasture, of storms that buried fences, of neighbors who rode 30 miles through snow to deliver medicine. Parents told children what the land was like before settlement thickened, what mistakes must never be repeated, what signs in the sky or snow meant danger. Oral knowledge passed from one generation to the next, in kitchens and parlors glowing with lamplight. Music, too, had its place. Perhaps a fiddle, perhaps a harmonica, perhaps only singing, but those small acts of sound pushed back against the stillness beyond the walls. Winter silence on the plains could feel endless, and people needed rhythm, laughter, and ritual to endure it. Some families played cards, some read aloud from the Bible or from old newspapers and borrowed books. Some worked in near silence, comfortable with one another in a way modern life rarely demands. The family home became a shelter not just from cold, but from isolation. That isolation could be severe. In many places, a ranch family might not see visitors for days or weeks during bad weather. Mail might be delayed, roads blocked, creeks impassable, and the nearest town effectively unreachable. Imagine illness in such a setting. A fever rising while snow piles against the house, a child cowing through the night, a mother measuring out home remedies because the doctor is too far away to reach team. Winter on the ranch could be frightening in ways that went far beyond discomfort, and this uncertainty made communities cherish one another even more when contact was possible. When neighbors did visit in winter, it was rarely casual. It often meant something important: help with a carving problem, borrowed supplies, news from town, a church gathering, a shared meal, or simple human company after too many days alone. Rural families formed strong bonds because they understood how much depended on cooperation. In a storm country, independence had limits. People spoke proudly of self-reliance, but the truth was that survival also rested on reciprocity. The willingness to dig someone at, lend hay, sit through the night with the sick, or ride out in weather no one should riding through. One of the hardest parts of winter ranch life was water. Today a faucet seems ordinary, but on old ranches, water in winter was work. Wells could freeze, pumps could fail, creeks ice over, and a very gallon for drinking, cooking, washing, or livestock had to be secured through effort. Carrying buckets in sub-zero weather was routine, and so was rationing. People learned quickly that waste was a kind of risk. Nothing was taken for granted. Not heat, not light, not food, not water, not even time. Meals in winter reflected thought, practical mindset. They had to be filling, warm, and efficient. Beans, bread, stews, salt pork, potatoes, biscuits, gravy, dried fruit, preserved vegetables, sometimes fresh meat if an animal had been butchered. Coffee was treasured, so was sugar, and treats were rare enough to feel meaningful. A pie baked on a bitter evening, molasses cookies shared after chores, a pot of soup that seemed to restore life to frozen hands. Food was emotional, as physical. It reminded a tired family that comfort still existed, and winter work never truly stopped. Even indoors there were harnesses to mend, wool to spin, quilts to patch, tools to repair, candles to dip, accounts to review, plans to make for spring. Ranch life had little separation between home and labor. The house itself was part workshop, part classroom, part refuge. Children learned arithmetic at the table where dough was needed. Adults discussed livestock losses while sewing by lamplight, and practical knowledge was absorbed, not through lectures, but by living close to necessity. There was also the matter of animals being born in winter, especially on ranches where calving or lambing overlapped the cold months that could turn an already demanding season into one of relentless vigilance. A weak calf in freezing temperatures needed immediate care, brought inside, rubbed down, bottle-fed, sometimes sleeping for a night near the stove before being returned to the barn ranch. Children often remembered these moments vividly. The warmth of a newborn animal in the kitchen, the smell of hay-on milk inside the house, the sense that life and death were held only inches apart during winter. Harsh winters also reshaped time itself. Days were shorter, but they felt longer. The dark came early. The chores seemed endless, and yet the season could pass in a blur of repetition. People counted winter not by dates on a calendar, but by storms survived, woodpiles shrinking, stores remaining, animals lost or saved, and small signs that spring was still possible. A slightly softer wind, a drip from the roof edge, a patch of earth showing near the barn. Hope on a ranch was often physical, something you could see, smell, or step on. And perhaps that is why winter formed such powerful memories in ranch families, because it stripped life down to essentials: warmth, food, labor, trust, patience, faith. When modern people look back on old ranch life, they often see romance first, the horses, the mountains, the frontier toughness, but the families who actually lived it knew something more intimate. The real story was not grand adventure every day. It was smaller and harder than that. Getting the fire going before dawn, mending the same coat again, checking a drifting fence line, listening for a cough in the next room, praying the hay lasted, praying the storm passed, praying everyone woke healthy the next morning. Still, there was pride in that life. Deep pride in it, only in surviving, but in being capable. Ranch families knew things the modern world has nearly forgotten. How torrid, whether in the behavior of animals, how to preserve food for months, how to keep children occupied without, how to endure boredom without panic, how to repair instead of replace, how to share space without a scapegoat to work, even when no one was watching. Winter tested them, yes, but it also revealed what they were made of. For fathers and mothers, winter carried another burden too. The emotional responsibility of staying steady. Children took their cues from adults. If fear filled the room, it spread quickly. So even in hard times, parents often tried to create a sense of normal life. Lessons at the table, chores on schedule, meals at regular hours, maybe laughter when they could manage it. Perhaps that quiet steadiness was one of the greatest gifts ranch parents gave their children. Not the absence of hardship, but the example of meeting it with discipline and courage. And for the children who grew up in such households, winter became a school unlike any other. They learned that comfort was precious, that work tied people together, that nature could not be bargained with, and that family was not merely a set of feelings. It was a living arrangement of duty, sacrifice, and love. They learned that everyone's effort mattered, and that survival often depended on small repeated acts: bringing in wood, feeding a horse, keeping the fire alive, watching over a younger sibling. Little things done faithfully, day after day. Not every winter was equally severe, of course. Some passed with manageable and occasional storms. Others became legendary, remembered for decades. The winter, the snow came to the windows. Winter, the cattle drifted and were lost. The winter, the creek froze so deep it held for weeks. The winter, no one could reach town for a month. These stories became part of family identity, told and retold, because they marked not only suffering, but endurance. They answered the question future generations would always ask: what were they like, the people who came before us? The answer, in many cases, is that they were ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things repeatedly. They were not fearless. They were not untouched by grief or weariness. They were simply committed to the animals, to the land, to their children in the next room, to the spouse beside them. Winter did not make them perfect, but it made clear what mattered. And sometimes that kind of clarity is what people remember most. As night settled over the ranch, after the last feeding, After the lanterns were checked, after the door was barred against wind, the family gathered once more under the low roof of their hard-won warmth. Outside, thunderstorm might still be moving over the fields, burying tracks, rattling shutters, pressing against the walls, but inside, there was soup on the table, a kettle on the stove, wool socks drying by the fire, the murmur of voices, the comfort of nearness. And perhaps that is the part of the story most worth, not only that ranchers endured harsh winters, but how they endured them together. Because in the end, winter on the old ranch was never just about cold weather. It was about a way of life built on preparation, labor, and family, a world where survival depended on skill, but also on tenderness, where a strength meant feeding stock in a blizzard and then coming home to rock a baby to sleep, where women and men and children all carried part of the load, where the house glowed against a darkness that seemed endless, and where every spring was earned. So the next time you imagine the old, do not picture only the romance of the open range. Picture the winter too, the frost in the window, the smell of wood smoke, the frozen pump, the barn lantern swinging in the mother at the stove, the father at the gate, the children learning without being told, and a family holding fast against the season, not because it was easy, not because it was beautiful every moment, but because it was their life, and because together they knew how to live it.